The tale of Lazarus, immortalized by the Gospel of John, has been told and retold through centuries. It is a story of divine intervention, an extraordinary defiance of mortality and faith rewarded. Yet, the first resurrection is only half the story. What of the man who lived, died, was resurrected, and then, inevitably, died again? This is the story of the second death of Lazarus. When Jesus called him forth from the tomb, Lazarus emerged into daylight, his body still swaddled in burial cloths, the scent of myrrh and decay clinging to his skin. His sisters, Mary and Martha, wept with joy and awe, falling at Jesus' feet in gratitude. The crowd murmured in disbelief, their wide eyes darting between Lazarus and the Savior. For weeks, perhaps months, the miracle remained fresh, both in Lazarus's mind and in the minds of everyone who knew him. He became a living testament to Jesus' power and a symbol of hope. Yet for Lazarus himself, life after death was a strange, disconcerting thing. He bore the unique burden of being one of the only men to have seen the veil between life and death parted. The world seemed brighter, louder, and sharper to Lazarus after his return. Flowers appeared more vivid, the sound of birds more melodic. Yet a shadow lingered over him. In quiet moments, he could still recall the silence of death, a silence so profound it seemed to stretch into eternity. Though he had been brought back, he could not forget the sensation of nothingness, nor could he escape the lingering awareness that he was now living on borrowed time. What was death? The question haunted him, gnawed at the edges of his joy. Some days he would sit alone, gazing out over Bethany, the village where he had lived, died, and lived again. Passers-by might see him and whisper to one another, wondering what it felt like to have been dead. Was it darkness? Light? Did you see Abraham? Moses? God himself? They asked him. To all inquiries, Lazarus would only offer a faint smile and shake his head. What words could explain the inexplicable? As months turned to years, Lazarus settled back into the rhythms of daily life. The awe surrounding his resurrection faded into the mundane realities of existence. He tilled the soil, traded in the marketplace, and worshipped at the synagogue like any other man. Yet he was never quite like any other man. There were those who saw him as a living miracle, and they sought him out, hoping that proximity to him might grant them a sliver of divine favor. Others viewed him with suspicion, believing his resurrection to be unnatural, perhaps even an affront to God's order. Lazarus bore both reverence and scorn with quiet dignity. Yet within his heart, he carried a weight few could understand. He had been given life once more, but what was he to do with it? Should he spend it preaching, working, or seeking out Jesus to ask why he, of all people, had been chosen for such a gift? In time, word came of Jesus' crucifixion. Lazarus mourned, for he owed his second life to the man who had been nailed to the cross. News of the resurrection of Christ followed, a miracle that echoed his own. The stories inspired faith in some and fear in others, and they made Lazarus reflect deeply on the purpose of his own miraculous second chance. In the years that followed, Lazarus lived quietly, avoiding the tumult of politics and religion that swirled in Jerusalem and beyond. He was no preacher, nor a prophet. He was a man, trying to live out the days given to him. But always, he wondered, would death come for him again? And if so, would it be the same? Lazarus was not immune to the wear of time. His hair turned silver, his steps slowed, and his skin grew lined. Yet he lived longer than most, as if even death hesitated to approach him again. His sisters, Mary and Martha, had long since passed, and their house in Bethany grew quiet, filled only with memories and the whisper of the wind. One night, as he sat by the fire, his breath shallow and his heart weary, he felt the familiar presence of death. This time, there was no fear. He had lived twice, loved deeply, and marveled at the mysteries of God. He closed his eyes and let out a soft sigh, feeling the weight of his years slip away. When the morning light broke through the windows of Lazarus's home, it found him still and at peace. There was no struggle in his passing, no sorrow. The villagers who discovered him wept, for they had lost a man who was both a friend and a symbol of divine grace. But Lazarus himself was beyond sorrow. In that second death, there was a quiet finality. This time, no voice called him forth from the tomb. This time, he did not awaken. And what awaited him on the other side? Was it the silence he remembered, or the eternal light promised by the scriptures? Perhaps Lazarus, the man who lived twice, finally found the answers to the questions that had haunted him. Or perhaps he simply rested, free at last from the burdens of life and the shadow of death. The second death of Lazarus did not inspire the same awe or wonder as the first. There were no crowds gathered at his tomb, no miraculous intervention to rewrite his fate. Yet in the quiet of Bethany, his story lived on, passed from one generation to the next. The villagers spoke of the man who had seen both sides of existence, whose life was a testament to the power of God and the inevitability of mortality. His life, both of them, became a parable of hope, faith, and the enduring mystery of existence. And so, the story of Lazarus came to an end, not in grandeur but in peace. The man who was called forth from the grave returned to it once more, leaving behind a legacy that transcended life and death.